On October 14, 2014, an episode of The Amazing World of Gumball aired in the United States that had already been edited 3 separate times before reaching the broadcast. The original cut contained a sequence that Cartoon Network's Standards and Practices Department flagged within hours of receiving it. The second cut removed the flag sequence but introduced a replacement scene that was flagged for different reasons. The third cut, the one that eventually aired, contained neither the original sequence nor its replacement. It contained a gap. A moment where the narrative jumps forward without explanation, where a scene ends and the next scene begins, and the space between them holds the ghost of something that was made and then unmade. Most viewers did not notice the gap, but the gap is there, and the story of how it got there is the story of what happens when a children's animated series pushes against the boundaries of what it is allowed to show. That episode was not illegal. None of the episodes on this list are illegal in the criminal sense. No one was arrested for making them. No court issued an injunction against their broadcast. But the word illegal in the context of children's television has a specific meaning that is worth understanding before we go any further. An episode becomes illegal when it violates the broadcast standards of the territory in which it airs. The violation can be content-based, depicting material that the territory's regulatory framework prohibits in children's programming. The violation can be timing-based, airing material that is permitted for older audiences but prohibited during the time slots reserved for children's content. The violation can be cultural, containing material that is legal in the territory of production but prohibited in the territory of broadcast. The word illegal in this context means this was made and then someone with institutional authority decided that you were not allowed to see it. Before we continue, subscribing helps these long videos keep coming. It is free and it takes a few seconds. Now, back to the episodes. 10 episodes, or 10 moments within episodes, that crossed a line that the show was not supposed to cross. Each one tells a story about boundaries, about who draws them, about who enforces them, about what happens to the creative work that exists on the wrong side of them. Each version tells a different part of the story, and each part changes the meaning of every other part. The first of these illegal episodes involves a sequence that was produced for the show's second season and removed before broadcast in every territory. The sequence depicted a character in a situation that, while played for comedy within the show's established tonal range, was interpreted by the Standards Department as a depiction of self-harm. The interpretation was debatable. The sequence, as described by people who saw the original cut, depicted a character engaging in behavior that was physically reckless, but not explicitly self-destructive. The character was not attempting to harm themselves. They were attempting to accomplish a comedic objective through means that happened to involve physical risk. But the Standards Department's interpretation did not require intentionality. The visual depiction of a character in physical jeopardy, regardless of the character's intent, was sufficient to trigger the removal. The removal process itself reveals how content regulation operates within a large media corporation. The Standards and Practices Department at Cartoon Network operates independently of the creative teams that produce the network's shows. The department's role is to review content before broadcast and identify material that might violate regulatory guidelines, generate audience complaints, or create legal exposure for the network. The review is systematic. Every episode of every show is screened before it airs. The screeners are trained to identify specific categories of content: violence, sexual material, substance use, language, and themes that might be inappropriate for the show's target audience. The categories are defined by guidelines that are updated periodically to reflect changes in regulatory standards and audience expectations. The first illegal episode's removal was handled quietly. The production team was informed that the sequence could not air. They were given the option to produce a replacement scene or to simply cut the sequence and adjust the surrounding material to close the gap. They chose to cut. The decision was pragmatic. Producing a replacement scene would require additional animation time, additional voice recording, additional compositing work, all of which would cost money and delay the episode's delivery. Cutting was faster and cheaper. The cut left a small narrative gap that the production team attempted to minimize through editorial adjustments, extending adjacent scenes slightly, adding a brief transitional moment that bridged the gap without fully concealing it. The creative team's response to the first removal established a pattern that would repeat throughout the show's run. The initial reaction was frustration. The sequence had been produced in good faith within what the team believed to be the show's established boundaries. The removal felt arbitrary, a judgment made by people who did not understand the show's tone or its audience's expectations. But the frustration was followed by acceptance and the acceptance was followed by adaptation. The broader context of the self-harm flagging connects to a conversation about children's animation that was intensifying during the period when the episode was produced. Mental health advocacy organizations had been increasing pressure on children's media companies to be more careful about depictions that could be interpreted as normalizing self-destructive behavior. The pressure was well-intentioned. Research on the relationship between media depictions and youth behavior, while not conclusive, had identified correlations that warranted caution. But the caution, when applied to animated content that operates through exaggeration and physical comedy, created interpretive challenges that the advocacy organization's guidelines did not fully address. An animated character running into a wall at high speed is a staple of physical comedy that has been present in animation since the medium's earliest days. The same action, interpreted through the lens of self-harm awareness, becomes a depiction of a character deliberately injuring themselves. The interpretation transforms the content without changing the content itself. The production team's frustration with the first removal was compounded by their awareness of the show's audience. They knew from direct engagement with fans and from internal research conducted by the network that their audience was sophisticated enough to distinguish between cartoon physical comedy and realistic depictions of self-harm. They knew that the sequence they had produced was funny, not distressing, to the children who would watch it. But their knowledge of their audience did not override the standards department's authority to make the final determination about what that audience could see. The asymmetry between creative knowledge and institutional authority is one of the defining tensions of children's television production. The first illegal episode also established the financial dimension of content removal that would recur throughout the show's history. Every removal has a cost. The cost includes the creative labor that produced the removed content, the editorial labor required to modify the episode, and the opportunity cost of the production time that could have been spent on new content rather than on reworking existing content. The costs are individually small but cumulatively significant over the course of a multi-season production. By the end of the show's run, the cumulative cost of content removals and modifications represented a meaningful fraction of the show's total production budget. The institutional memory of the first removal affected the creative team's approach to physical comedy for the remainder of the show's run. Storyboard artists who were designing physical comedy sequences began self-screening their work through the lens of the standards department's interpretation. They asked themselves before submitting a sequence for production, could this be interpreted as self-harm? The question, once introduced, could not be unasked. It became part of the creative process, an invisible reviewer sitting alongside the artist at their desk, evaluating every drawing, every action, every physical gag for its potential to trigger a regulatory response. The invisible reviewer made the show safer. It also made the show slightly less spontaneous, slightly less willing to follow a physical comedy idea to its logical extreme. The first removal's most lasting effect was not the content it eliminated, but the content it prevented from being created. The first illegal episode also established the specific vocabulary that the production team and the standards department would use to communicate about content disputes for the rest of the show's run. Words like threshold, which described the point at which acceptable content became unacceptable. Words like flagged, which described the identification of potentially problematic content. Words like mitigated, which described the process of modifying content to reduce its regulatory risk. The vocabulary was clinical, institutional, deliberately unemotional. It was designed to facilitate productive communication between parties whose interests were not fully aligned. The creative team wanted to make the best show they could. The standards department wanted to prevent the show from generating complaints or regulatory action. The vocabulary bridged the gap between these interests by providing a shared language in which both interests could be expressed without confrontation. Resources that were spent not on creating the show, but on uncreating parts of it. The team learned from the removal. They developed a more precise understanding of where the boundaries were, not the official boundaries described in the standards documents, but the actual boundaries as interpreted by the specific individuals who reviewed the show's content. The distinction between the official boundaries and the actual boundaries is one of the most important and least discussed aspects of content regulation in children's television. The official boundaries are written, the actual boundaries are interpreted, and the interpretation varies depending on who is doing the interpreting, which means that the boundaries are never fully stable, never fully predictable. The standards department's review process for animated content operates on a schedule that is aligned with the production pipeline, but not fully integrated into it. Episodes are submitted for review after they are substantially complete, which means that the creative team has already invested the full production cost of the content before learning whether the content will be approved. The timing creates a structural incentive for self-censorship, A team that submits content knowing that rejection will waste the production investment has a financial incentive to avoid content that might be rejected. The incentive operates independently of any creative or ethical judgment. It is purely economic, and its economic purity makes it one of the most powerful forces shaping children's content. More powerful than the standards guidelines themselves because it operates before the guidelines are applied. The first illegal episode's specific content, the scene depicting physical recklessness that was interpreted as self-harm, existed at the intersection of several regulatory categories. It was flagged under the violence category because the scene depicted potential physical injury. It was flagged under the themes category because the scene could be interpreted as depicting self-destructive behavior. And it was flagged under a more general concern about imitation, the fear that young viewers might attempt to replicate the character's behavior in their own lives. The multi-category flagging made the appeal process more difficult because the creative team needed to address each category separately, and the arguments that were effective against the violence categorization were not necessarily effective against the imitation concern. The imitation concern is one of the most contentious aspects of children's content regulation. The concern is based on the theory that children learn behavior by observing and imitating models, including fictional models presented in media. The theory is well established in developmental psychology, but its application to animated content is complicated by the fact that animated behavior is frequently impossible to imitate. A character who runs off a cliff and hovers in the air before falling is performing an action that no child can replicate. The impossibility of imitation should, in theory, reduce the regulatory concern, but the Standards Department's interpretation of the imitation theory does not always distinguish between imitatable and non-imitatable behavior. The distinction is judged case by case, and the judgment is influenced by factors that are not purely theoretical, including the department's institutional memory of past controversies and its assessment of the current public mood regarding children's media safety. Never fully knowable until a specific piece of content is submitted for review and either approved or rejected. The first illegal episode's legacy within the show's production history is difficult to overstate. It was the episode that taught the team the vocabulary of regulatory engagement. Before this episode, the creative staff approached the standards department as an obstacle, a barrier between their creative vision and the audience. After this episode, they understood the relationship differently. The standards department was not merely an obstacle. It was an interlocutor. It had its own logic, its own concerns, its own institutional pressures, and engaging with those pressures productively required understanding them rather than simply resenting them. The specific concern that drove the first episode's removal, the interpretation of physical comedy as self-harm, is one that has grown more urgent in the years since the episode was produced. Public awareness of self-harm among young people has increased dramatically. The research literature on the relationship between media depictions and self-harm behavior has expanded. The regulatory frameworks governing children's media have responded to this increased awareness by becoming more sensitive to potential self-harm interpretations. Content that would have been approved without comment in the early 2000s is now flagged routinely. The first illegal episode was, in some sense, ahead of its time. It triggered a regulatory response that anticipated the broader cultural shift by several years. But the episode also raises a question that the regulatory framework has never satisfactorily answered. At what point does protecting children from potentially harmful content become a form of intellectual condescension? Children are not passive recipients of media, they are active interpreters. They bring their own experiences, their own understanding, their own developmental context to every piece of content they consume. A child who watches a cartoon character engage in exaggerated physical comedy does not necessarily interpret that comedy as a model for behavior. The child may interpret it as humor, as fantasy, as an expression of frustration that mirrors their own feelings without prescribing a specific response to those feelings. The regulatory framework assumes the worst-case interpretation and regulates accordingly, which is the conservative and defensible approach. But it is also an approach that systematically underestimates the interpretive capacity of the very people it claims to protect. The second illegal episode involved the show's treatment of religious imagery. An episode produced during the third season contained a background detail visible for approximately 4 seconds in a single shot that depicted a religious symbol in a context that could be interpreted as satirical. The detail was not central to the episode's narrative. It was not referenced in the dialogue. It existed in the visual periphery, the kind of background detail that the show routinely embedded in its environments, as Easter eggs for attentive viewers. But the detail was identified during the standards review and flagged for removal in several territories where the depicted religion held significant cultural influence. The removal of the religious imagery was not uniform across territories. In some markets, the entire shot was replaced with an alternative version that substituted a neutral image for the religious symbol. In other markets, the shot was shortened so that the background detail was visible for less than a second, making it effectively invisible to casual viewers. In a small number of markets, the episode aired with the original detail intact, because the territory's regulatory framework did not prohibit the depiction. The result was that the same episode existed in multiple versions across the global broadcast, each version slightly different from the others, each version reflecting the specific religious and cultural sensitivities of the territory in which it aired. The second illegal episode was not one episode, it was a dozen different episodes, each one tailored to a different audience, each one reflecting a different set of assumptions about what that audience could and could not be shown. The religious imagery controversy revealed a structural tension in the show's production process that would recur throughout its run. The show was produced in London by a predominantly European creative team, whose cultural assumptions about religion, humor, and the intersection of the two were different from the cultural assumptions of some of the show's broadcast territories. A visual joke that the London team considered mild and uncontroversial could generate formal complaints in territories where the same religious tradition held a different cultural position. The production team could not anticipate every cultural flashpoint. They could not know which background details would be flagged and which would pass without comment. The unpredictability of the flagging process created an atmosphere of creative caution that shaped the show in ways that you could not see. The specific process by which religious imagery was identified and evaluated reveals the cultural biases embedded in the regulatory framework. The Standards Department's guidelines address the major world religions with varying degrees of specificity. Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, and Buddhism were explicitly referenced in the guidelines, with specific instructions about what constituted respectful and disrespectful depiction. But the guidelines were written from a Western perspective, and they reflected Western assumptions about the relative sensitivity of different religious traditions. The guidelines were more detailed and more restrictive regarding religions that held significant political influence in the show's primary broadcast markets. The result was an uneven regulatory landscape in which some religious traditions were more protected than others, not because of any principal distinction, but because of the geographic distribution of regulatory power. The creative team's response to the religious imagery removal was to develop a more systematic approach to background design that reduced the likelihood of unintentional religious references. The approach involved creating a library of approved background elements, signs, symbols, logos, and text that had been pre-cleared by the Standards Department and could be used without risk of regulatory conflict. The library was practical and effective, but it also represented a narrowing of the show's visual vocabulary. The pre-approved elements were safe, but they were also generic. They lacked the specificity and the surprise of the original background details, the ones that were designed by individual artists exercising individual creative judgment without the constraint of pre-approval. The trade-off between safety and specificity is one that the show navigated throughout its run, and the navigation was never fully satisfactory to either the creative team or the Standards Department. The second illegal episode also raised questions about the show's relationship with satire that would recur in subsequent episodes. The show's creative team understood satire as a legitimate mode of engagement with serious subjects, including religion. Satire does not attack its subject. It illuminates it, revealing contradictions and absurdities that earnest treatment might overlook. But the Standards Department's guidelines did not distinguish between satire and attack. The guidelines prohibited disrespectful depiction without defining what constituted disrespect, and the absence of a definition meant that any depiction that could be interpreted as disrespectful, regardless of the creator's satirical intent, was subject to removal. The process by which the second illegal episode was modified across territories also reveals the logistical complexity of international content management. When a scene is flagged for modification in specific territories, the production team must produce alternative versions of the scene that comply with each territory's requirements, while maintaining the episode's narrative coherence. The alternatives must match the original scene's duration because changing the duration of a scene changes the episode's total runtime, which affects the scheduling of the broadcast. The alternatives must maintain visual continuity with the surrounding scenes, because a visible transition between the modified and unmodified portions of the episode would call attention to the modification and undermine the illusion that you are watching the complete episode. And the alternatives must be produced within the existing production budget, which means that the resources devoted to creating alternative versions are resources diverted from creating new content. The sheer volume of alternative versions that the show's international distribution required is staggering when considered in aggregate. Over the course of 6 seasons, broadcasting in more than 120 territories, the show produced hundreds of alternative scenes, each one tailored to the specific requirements of a specific market. The cumulative labor involved in producing these alternatives is one of the hidden costs of international distribution that is rarely acknowledged in discussions of the show's production history. The show was not one show. It was dozens of shows, each one slightly different from the others, and the production of those dozens required labor that is invisible in the finished product. The religious dimension of the second illegal episode connects to a broader pattern in the show's regulatory history. The show's creative team, operating from a culturally European perspective, occasionally produced content that reflected European attitudes toward religion that were incompatible with the attitudes of some of the show's broadcast territories. The incompatibility was not intentional. The team was not trying to offend. They were working within their own cultural framework. The assumptions were not wrong. They were culturally specific. A visual joke about religion that is acceptable in a post-secular European context may be profoundly disrespectful in a context where religion occupies a different cultural position, where the boundary between sacred and profane is drawn differently, where humor about religious subjects carries different social consequences. The second illegal episode's regulatory history illustrates a structural problem in international content distribution that has no obvious solution. A show produced for global distribution must either produce content that is acceptable in all territories, which effectively means producing content that is constrained by the most restrictive territory standards, or produce content that varies across territories, which requires the production of multiple versions and the acceptance that no audience receives the complete show. Gumball chose the second approach, producing alternative versions for territories with more restrictive standards. The choice preserved the show's creative ambition in its primary markets while accommodating the regulatory requirements of its secondary markets. But the choice also created a two-tier audience: viewers in permissive territories who received the complete show, and viewers in restrictive territories who received an edited version. The two-tier structure raises questions about equity and access that the entertainment industry has not fully addressed. Producing content that reflected their own assumptions about what constituted respectful and humorous engagement with religious subjects. The regulatory responses from specific territories informed the team that their assumptions were not universal, that humor about religion is culturally specific, and that a joke that is acceptable in one cultural context can be deeply offensive in another. The education was valuable, but it came at the cost of creative content that had been produced, reviewed, and found wanting by standards that the creators had not fully understood when they created it. The conflation of satire with disrespect is one of the most creatively destructive aspects of content regulation in children's television, and the second illegal episode is a specific instance of that destruction. Background details became simpler. Visual jokes became less specific. The rich, densely layered visual environments that had characterized the show's early seasons became slightly less dense, slightly less layered, slightly less likely to contain the kind of detail that might trigger a regulatory response in a territory the team had never visited. The chilling effect of the second illegal episode is worth naming precisely because chilling effects are, by their nature, invisible. You cannot point to a specific background detail and say, this is the joke that was never drawn because the team was afraid of regulatory consequences. You cannot identify the specific visual gag that existed in a storyboard artist's imagination, but never made it to the storyboard because the artist had internalized the lesson of the second illegal episode. The absence is real, but unmeasurable. What you can observe is the general trend. The show's visual density decreased over time. The backgrounds became less cluttered, less referential, less likely to reward the kind of close examination that fans had come to expect. Some of this decrease was the natural result of production efficiency. Simpler backgrounds are faster to produce. But some of it, according to former members of the production team, was a direct response to the regulatory risk that complex backgrounds represented. The second illegal episode also introduced the concept of retroactive compliance to the show's production vocabulary. Once the religious imagery was identified in a completed episode, the team had to go back through previously completed episodes and audit their backgrounds for similar content. This audit consumed production time and creative energy that would otherwise have been devoted to new content. The audit also had a psychological effect on the team. Reviewing your own completed work for potential regulatory violations is a different creative experience from reviewing it for quality or consistency. It transforms the review process from an act of pride into an act of anxiety. The team was no longer looking at their backgrounds and thinking, "Is this good?" They were looking at their backgrounds and thinking, "Could this get us in trouble?" The shift in perspective is subtle but consequential. It changes the relationship between the creator and the work, from one of ownership to one of liability. The religious imagery dispute also revealed the impossibility of creating truly neutral visual content for a global audience. Every symbol carries meaning, and different cultures assign different meanings to the same symbols. A cross is a religious symbol in one territory and a mathematical operator in another. A crescent is a religious emblem in one context and a phase of the moon in another. The production team could not strip their backgrounds of every symbol that any culture anywhere on Earth might interpret as religiously significant, without stripping those backgrounds of visual interest entirely. The compromise they reached was pragmatic rather than principled. They removed the most obviously recognizable religious symbols and accepted that subtler references would inevitably slip through. The third illegal episode is the one that generated the most public attention, and it involved the show's depiction of a kiss between two characters of the same gender. The episode, which aired during the show's 4th season, contained a brief scene in which two male-presenting characters kissed. The kiss was contextualized within the episode's narrative. It was not gratuitous, it was not provocative, it was a moment of affection between two characters whose relationship had been developing across multiple episodes. But the kiss was illegal in the broadcast standard sense in several territories where the depiction of same-gender affection in children's programming was prohibited by law or by regulatory practice. The response to the kiss scene was swift and geographically specific. Territories in Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Southeast Asia either removed the scene entirely or replaced it with an alternative shot that depicted the characters in a non-romantic configuration. The removal was mandated by local regulatory authorities in some territories, and by the network's own preemptive editorial decisions in others. The distinction between mandated removal and preemptive removal is significant because it reveals the different mechanisms by which content regulation operates across territories. In some markets, the regulatory authority has the power to block an episode from broadcast if it contains prohibited content. In these markets, the network has no choice but to comply. In other markets, the regulatory authority relies on the network's self-regulation, trusting the network to screen its own content and remove material that violates local standards. In these markets, the network makes the removal decision, and the decision is influenced by factors beyond the regulatory guidelines: the network's assessment of the market's cultural temperature, the network's desire to avoid complaints, the network's calculation of the risk-reward ratio of broadcasting potentially controversial content. The kiss scene controversy generated international media coverage that extended far beyond the show's usual audience. News outlets in multiple countries reported on the scene's removal, and the reporting framed the removal in terms of a broader cultural conflict between progressive and conservative attitudes toward LGBTQ representation in children's media. The show, which had depicted the kiss as a small, quiet, unremarkable moment of affection, found itself at the center of a cultural debate that dwarfed the scene's actual content. The debate was about the scene, but it was also about everything the scene represented. The question of whether children's media should reflect the diversity of human relationships. The question of whether children are harmed by seeing same-gender affection depicted in their entertainment. The question of who has the authority to decide what children are allowed to see. The production team's response to the controversy was measured and deliberate. They did not apologize for the scene. They did not promise to avoid similar content in the future. They continued to depict the characters' relationship in subsequent episodes, though the specific form of affection depicted was calibrated to the knowledge they had gained about which forms of depiction would survive the standards review and which would not. The geographic pattern of the removals is worth examining in detail, because it reveals the global landscape of LGBTQ rights as reflected through the lens of children's media regulation. The territories that removed the kiss scene were not randomly distributed. They formed a pattern that mapped with uncomfortable precision onto the global geography of LGBTQ legal recognition. Territories with legal protections for LGBTQ individuals generally aired the scene intact. Territories with legal prohibitions against LGBTQ expression generally removed it. The correlation was not perfect. Some territories with progressive legal frameworks removed the scene preemptively, and some territories with restrictive frameworks aired it without modification. But the general pattern was clear enough to make the episode's broadcast history a kind of political map, with the presence or absence of a brief animated kiss marking the boundaries of cultural acceptance. What is rarely discussed about the third illegal episode is the way it changed the show's internal creative conversations about representation. Before this episode, the production team had included diverse characters and relationships as a natural extension of Elmore's Anything Goes reality. The inclusion was casual, which was part of its charm. Characters existed in relationships that reflected the full spectrum of human connection, and the show did not announce these relationships or treat them as special. They simply were. The third illegal episode made it impossible to maintain this casual approach. Once the team knew that certain types of representation would trigger regulatory responses in certain territories, they had to make a choice. They could continue including the representation and accept the territorial edits, or they could preemptively remove the representation to ensure a uniform global broadcast. They chose the former, which was the principal decision, but the decision itself transformed the nature of the inclusion. What had been casual became deliberate. What had been natural became political. The act of including a relationship that you know will be censored in certain territories is a fundamentally different creative act from including a relationship that you expect will be broadcast uniformly. The third illegal episode also demonstrated something important about the relationship between children's media and social change. The territories that removed the kiss scene did not simply remove a moment of animation. They removed the possibility of a particular kind of normalization. Children who grew up watching the unedited version of the episode grew up in a media environment where same-gender affection was depicted as ordinary, unremarkable, part of the everyday texture of a cartoon world. Children who grew up watching the edited version grew up in a media environment where that depiction was absent, where the gap left by the removed scene was filled by the implication that something had been there and been taken away. The two groups of children received different messages about the world, and the difference was created not by the production team's creative choices, but by the regulatory decisions of institutions they would never interact with directly. The fan advocacy that followed the third illegal episode's territorial edits was among the earliest examples of organized international resistance to children's media censorship. Through social media, the campaigns were not merely emotional responses. They were coordinated efforts that identified the specific regulatory bodies responsible for the removals, researched the legal frameworks under which the removals had been justified, and developed targeted arguments for reinstatement. Some of these campaigns succeeded in territories where the regulatory framework permitted appeal. Most did not, but the campaigns themselves became a story, covered by media outlets that would not normally report on the editorial decisions made about a children's cartoon, and the coverage amplified the very representation that the removals had attempted to suppress. The third illegal episode also intersects with a broader conversation about the role of children's media in shaping social attitudes across generations. The research on media influence suggests that early exposure to diverse representations has a measurable effect on children's attitudes toward difference. Children who see same-gender relationships depicted casually in their media environment are statistically more likely to develop accepting attitudes toward those relationships as they grow older. The removal of the kiss scene in certain territories was therefore not merely an editorial decision about a single episode, it was a decision that contributed, however marginally, to the maintenance of social attitudes that the production team's creative choice had been designed to gently challenge. The production team's decision to continue depicting the characters' relationship in subsequent episodes, despite knowing that certain territories would edit those depictions, represents a form of creative persistence that is easy to overlook but difficult to sustain. Every time they included a scene that they knew would be removed in some markets, they were choosing to create content that would not reach all of their audience. They were accepting that the version of the show that existed in some territories would be incomplete, a version with gaps where relationships should have been. The acceptance of this incompleteness was its own kind of statement. It said, "This is part of our show, and if your regulatory framework removes it, the gap that remains is your gap, not ours." The show's fans responded to the removal with a level of organized advocacy that surprised both the production team and the network. Online campaigns demanded that the scene be restored in territories where it had been removed. Petitions gathered thousands of signatures. Fan-created content celebrating the character's relationship proliferated on social media platforms. The advocacy was driven partly by support for LGBTQ representation and partly by opposition to censorship in any form. The fans' position was that the scene was part of the show, that the show was created by its creators, and that the creators' work should reach you intact. The position was principled and understandable, and it was also practically impossible to implement, given the reality of international broadcast regulation. The long-term impact of the third illegal episode on the show's creative direction was more significant than any single scene might suggest. The episode demonstrated that the show could include LGBTQ representation. It demonstrated that the representation would be supported by a significant portion of the audience. And it demonstrated that the representation would be opposed by regulatory frameworks in specific territories. The three demonstrations, taken together, gave the creative team a clearer understanding of the costs and benefits of LGBTQ representation in their show. The representation was creatively important. It was supported by the audience. And it was expensive in terms of the editorial labor required to produce multiple versions of episodes for different territories. The team continued to include representation, but The third illegal episode's impact extended beyond Gumball to the broader landscape of children's animation. The episode became a reference point in the ongoing debate about LGBTQ representation in children's media, cited by advocates on both sides of the debate as evidence for their positions. Advocates for representation pointed to the episode as proof that LGBTQ content could be included in children's programming without harming the show's audience or its commercial performance. Opponents of representation pointed to the regulatory removals as evidence that the content was inappropriate for children and that the regulatory frameworks of multiple countries agreed. The debate, which the show's creative team had not sought to provoke, became part of the show's public identity in a way that the team could not control. The episode's legacy in the context of children's media history is significant. It was not the first children's animated show to depict same-gender affection, but it was one of the most visible instances of such depiction, and the controversy it generated contributed to the normalization of LGBTQ content in children's programming. Shows that came after Gumball, including Steven Universe, The Owl House, and others, pushed further in their representation, and they did so in a landscape that Gumball's third illegal episode had helped to create. The regulatory resistance that Gumball encountered was not eliminated by subsequent shows, but it was reduced, partly because the precedent of Gumball's broadcast had demonstrated that LGBTQ content in children's programming did not produce the harmful effects that opponents predicted. The personal stories of the team members who created the third illegal episode add an emotional dimension that the regulatory analysis cannot capture. Some members of the production team were themselves LGBTQ. The scene they had created was not an abstract exercise in representation. It was a reflection of their own lives, their own relationships, their own desire to see their experiences validated in the medium they had devoted their careers to. The regulatory removal of the scene in specific territories was experienced by these team members not as an institutional process, but as a personal rejection. The scene itself, viewed in isolation from the controversy it generated, is remarkably quiet. Two characters share a moment of affection. The animation is gentle. The music is soft. The scene is designed to be unremarkable, to present same-gender affection as an ordinary part of the show's emotional landscape rather than as a special event or a political statement. The ordinariness is the point. The show's creators understood that the most effective form of representation is not the dramatic gesture, but the quiet inclusion, the moment that passes without comment, because it does not require comment. The regulatory removal of the scene transformed the quiet into noise, the ordinary into extraordinary, the moment that was designed not to be noticed into the moment that everyone noticed. The aftermath of the third illegal episode's broadcast included a period of intense internal discussion within Cartoon Network about the network's policy on LGBTQ representation across its programming. The discussion involved executives, legal counsel, creative leadership, and representatives of the standards department. The discussion was not public. Its outcomes were communicated to the show's creative team through the established institutional channels. The outcomes were ambiguous. The network did not explicitly prohibit LGBTQ content. It did not explicitly encourage it. It established a framework for case-by-case evaluation that gave the creative teams more certainty about the process they would need to follow, but less certainty about the outcome of that process. The ambiguity was deliberate. It allowed the network to approve LGBTQ content when the institutional conditions favored approval and to reject it when they did not, without committing to a consistent policy that might generate its own controversy. A message from the regulatory authorities of multiple countries that the relationships were inappropriate for children to see. The emotional cost of the removal, which is not quantifiable and not accounted for in any production budget, is the third illegal episode's most significant and least visible legacy. The inclusion was informed by the knowledge that every instance would require additional work and would generate additional institutional friction. The calibration was itself a form of compromise, a negotiation between the team's creative convictions and the institutional constraints within which they operated. The show continued to include LGBTQ representation, but the representation was shaped by the knowledge that every depiction would be evaluated, territory by territory, against standards that varied from permissive to prohibitive. The fourth illegal episode involved the show's depiction of violence in a manner that was deemed excessive for children's programming. The episode, produced during the third season, contained a sequence in which a character's physical destruction was depicted with a level of detail and duration that exceeded the standards department's threshold for acceptable violence in children's content. The character, who was composed of a material that could be damaged and reformed, was shown being destroyed in a manner that was technically reversible within the show's logic, but visually distressing in a way that the standards department judged inappropriate for the target audience. The violence standards for children's animation are some of the most specifically defined and most inconsistently applied regulations in the broadcast industry. The standards specify in considerable detail the types of violence that are and are not permitted. Cartoon violence, defined as violence that does not result in realistic injury or lasting harm, is generally permitted. Violence that results in visible injury, that causes visible pain, or that is depicted with realistic consequence is generally prohibited. But the boundary between cartoon violence and realistic violence is not a clear line. It is a gradient, and the specific point on the gradient where acceptable becomes unacceptable varies depending on the show's visual style, the character's physical properties, and the interpretive tendencies of the individuals conducting the review. The sequence in the fourth illegal episode fell into a gray zone that the standards department resolved by erring on the side of caution. The character's destruction was technically consistent with the show's established rules, which allowed characters made of fragile materials to be damaged and reformed. But the duration of the destruction sequence, which lasted several seconds longer than similar sequences in previous episodes, and the visual detail of the destruction, which showed the character breaking apart in a manner that resembled realistic physical trauma more than cartoon slapstick, pushed the sequence past the standards department's threshold. The sequence was shortened in some territories and removed entirely in others. The violent standards reveal one of the most interesting paradoxes in children's content regulation. The same regulatory frameworks that restrict violent content in children's programming also permit the broadcast of violent content in programming aimed at older audiences that airs on the same networks during different time slots. A child who watches Gumball at 4 in the afternoon and then watches adult programming on the same network at 9 in the evening will see content that is dramatically more violent than anything the standards department has removed from the children's show. The regulatory framework does not account for the reality that children's viewing is not confined to children's programming time slots. The framework assumes that children watch children's content and adults watch adult content, an assumption that has been demonstrably false since the invention of the television remote control. The specific violence standards applied to animated content are different from the standards applied to live-action content, and the difference creates additional complications. Animated violence is generally held to a lower threshold of acceptability than live-action violence. Not because animated violence is considered more harmful, but because the distance between the animated depiction and real-world violence is considered to reduce the potential for imitative behavior. But the distance that protects animated violence from the strictest regulatory scrutiny also limits the show's ability to depict consequences. A show that cannot show realistic consequences of violence is a show that paradoxically might be more likely to normalize violence by depicting it without consequences. The regulatory framework's attempt to protect children from violent content may, in some cases, produce content that is less healthy than the content it replaces. The fourth illegal episode also introduced the production team to the concept of material-specific violence standards. Characters in Gumball are made of different materials. A character made of paper can be torn, a character made of glass can shatter, a character made of clay can be deformed. The violence that can be done to each character is specific to their material composition, and the standards department's assessment of the violence's appropriateness varied depending on the material involved. Tearing paper was generally acceptable. Shattering glass was sometimes flagged. Deforming a character made of organic material was almost always flagged. The material-specific standards created a hierarchy of acceptable violence that was logical in its own terms, but absurd when viewed from outside the regulatory framework. The material-specific violence standards created situations that the production team found both frustrating and comedically rich. The frustration came from the inconsistency. The comedic richness came from the absurdity of a regulatory framework that treated the destruction of a balloon differently from the destruction of a banana. Despite the fact that both characters were equally fictional and equally incapable of experiencing real pain, the team occasionally incorporated the absurdity of the violence standards into the show itself, creating episodes that played with the boundaries of acceptable violence in ways that were simultaneously funny and subversive. The meta-commentary was the team's creative response to a regulatory constraint that they could not eliminate but could illuminate. The fourth illegal episode also raised questions about the relationship between violence and consequences in animated content that have broader implications for children's media. The standards department's guidelines generally required that violent actions in children's programming be followed by consequences that discourage the violent behavior. Characters who acted violently should experience negative outcomes. Characters who were subjected to violence should recover quickly. The requirement for consequences created a structural tension with the show's established rule that characters made of fragile materials could be damaged and reformed without lasting harm. The show's world operated on the principle that physical damage is temporary. The Standards Department's guidelines operated on the principle that physical damage should have consequences. The two principles were incompatible, and the fourth illegal episode was the point where the incompatibility became a regulatory problem. The broader conversation about violence in children's media, which the fourth illegal episode contributed to, has been ongoing since the earliest days of television. The conversation follows a predictable pattern. A piece of content is produced that pushes against the current boundaries of acceptable violence. The content is flagged by regulatory authorities or advocacy groups. A debate ensues about whether the content is harmful. Research is cited on both sides. The boundaries are adjusted, usually in the direction of greater restriction. The cycle then repeats with a new piece of content that pushes against the newly adjusted boundaries. The fourth illegal episode also introduced the production team to the concept of durational sensitivity in violence regulation. The Standards Department's assessment of a violence sequence's appropriateness was influenced not only by the type and intensity of the violence, but by its duration. A brief moment of intense violence could be acceptable. A prolonged sequence of moderate violence could be unacceptable. The relationship between duration and acceptability was not linear. A sequence that was twice as long as another was not necessarily twice as objectionable. The relationship was more complex, shaped by factors including the pacing of the sequence, the emotional context, the presence or absence of comedic framing, and the sequence's position within the episode's overall narrative arc. The production team learned, through the fourth illegal episode and through subsequent regulatory encounters, to manage the duration of violent sequences, with a precision that approached mathematical calculation, measuring the seconds of screen time devoted to violent content against the Standards Department's known thresholds for durational acceptability. The fourth illegal episode's violence standards dispute was eventually resolved through a series of modifications that reduced the duration and detail of the destruction sequence without eliminating it entirely. The modified sequence preserved the comedic intent of the original, while reducing the visual intensity to a level that the Standards Department found acceptable. The modifications were skillful. A viewer who saw only the modified version would experience the sequence as a complete and satisfying piece of comedy. But a viewer who saw both versions would notice the difference. The original was funnier, more detailed, more visually inventive. The modified version was adequate, and the gap between adequate and excellent is the gap that content regulation creates in every episode it touches. The cycle has been repeating for decades, and the show's experience with the fourth illegal episode is one iteration of a cycle that shows no sign of ending. The show could destroy a paper character with impunity, but could not significantly damage a food character without triggering a review, producing the now familiar pattern of multiple versions of the same episode existing across the global broadcast. The fourth illegal episode's material-specific violence standards reveal one of the most counterintuitive aspects of children's television regulation. The system does not measure violence by its consequences within the narrative. It measures violence by its visual qualities, which means that the same narrative event, a character being harmed, can be either acceptable or unacceptable, depending entirely on how it looks. A character made of paper can be torn in half, crumpled, burned, or shredded, and the Standards Department will generally approve the depiction because paper destruction looks harmless. It looks like what happens when you throw away a piece of junk mail. A character made of flesh, even animated flesh, even clearly and obviously fictional animated flesh, cannot be subjected to the same treatment because flesh destruction looks like injury. The standard is not what the violence means, but what the violence resembles, and the gap between meaning and resemblance is where the fourth illegal episode lived. The production team had exploited this gap deliberately and skillfully throughout the show's run. They populated Elmore with characters made of every conceivable material, precisely because different materials permitted different types of physical comedy. A balloon character could be popped. A glass character could be shattered. A cloud character could be dispersed. Each material had its own set of permitted destructions, and the creative team had developed an intuitive understanding of which destructions would survive the standards review and which would not. The fourth illegal episode was a case where that intuition failed. The team had assumed that a particular material category permitted a particular type of physical comedy, and the Standards Department had disagreed. What makes this episode's regulatory history especially instructive is the way it demonstrates how material-specific standards interact with narrative context. The same action can be funny or disturbing depending on the story around it. A character being flattened in a slapstick chase sequence reads as comedy because the conventions of the genre tell you that the character will be fine. The same character being flattened in a scene of genuine conflict reads as violence because the narrative context tells you that the character is in real danger. The standards department's material-specific approach did not account for narrative context in any systematic way. A depiction was either acceptable or unacceptable based on its visual properties, regardless of whether the narrative frame presented the depiction as comedy or as threat. This meant that the show sometimes had depictions approved that were narratively quite dark, because they involved materials with permissive standards, and had depictions rejected that were narratively lighthearted, because they involved materials with restrictive standards. The fourth illegal episode forced the production team to develop a more sophisticated understanding of material categories than the standards department's own guidelines provided. They began tracking not just which materials permitted which types of physical interaction, but which combinations of material, action, and narrative context would trigger a review. The tracking was informal, maintained in the collective memory of the creative team rather than in any written document, but it was remarkably detailed. Over time, the team developed what amounted to a private regulatory code that was more nuanced than the official regulatory code, and they used this private code to navigate the space between what they wanted to create and what they were allowed to broadcast. The material-specific approach to violence regulation also had an unintended effect on the show's character design philosophy. New characters introduced in later seasons were designed with their material properties' regulatory implications in mind. A character who would need to participate in physical comedy was more likely to be designed as a material that permitted a wide range of physical interactions. A character who needed to convey vulnerability was more likely to be designed as a material with restrictive standards, because the restrictions themselves communicated fragility. The regulatory framework had become, without anyone intending it, a design constraint that influenced the show's creative DNA. The constraints were invisible to the audience, but they shaped the world that the audience experienced, determining which types of characters could exist and what those characters could do. The fifth illegal episode involved the show's engagement with substance use, specifically a sequence that depicted characters in a state that could be interpreted as intoxication. The show's visual language allowed for creative ambiguity. The characters were not depicted consuming alcohol or drugs. They were depicted consuming a fictional substance whose effects, exaggerated energy followed by physical collapse, resembled intoxication closely enough to trigger the standards review. The fictional substance defense, the argument that the depicted substance does not exist in the real world and therefore cannot constitute a depiction of real substance use, is a defense that animated shows have employed for decades with varying degrees of success. The fictional substance defense has a long and complicated history in children's animation that extends well beyond Gumball. Shows dating back to the 1960s and 1970s used fictional substances as narrative devices that allowed characters to experience altered states without the regulatory complications of depicting real substance use. The defense relies on the assumption that viewers can distinguish between fictional and real substances, and that the fictional context prevents the depiction from functioning as a model for real-world behavior. The assumption is reasonable for most viewers, but the standards department is not evaluating content for most viewers. It is evaluating content for the most vulnerable viewers, the youngest, the most impressionable, the most likely to misinterpret fictional content as guidance for real-world behavior. The department's obligation to protect the most vulnerable viewers shapes its interpretation of content in ways that may seem overly cautious to the average viewer, but are defensible within the regulatory logic that governs children's programming. The specific visual language that Gumball used to depict the fictional substance's effects was itself a creative achievement that the regulatory dispute threatened to erase. The animators had developed a visual vocabulary for depicting altered consciousness that was funny, inventive, and genuinely original. Characters moved differently. Colors shifted. The photographic backgrounds warped and distorted in ways that exploited the show's mixed media aesthetic to create visual effects that would have been impossible in a purely animated or purely live-action production. The visual creativity that the team brought to the depiction of altered states was one of the episode's most impressive qualities, and the removal of the sequence in several territories meant that you, if you lived in those territories, never saw some of the show's most innovative animation. The substance use episode also highlighted the problem of context in content regulation. The standards department evaluates content in isolation, assessing individual scenes against individual guidelines without fully accounting for the narrative context in which the scenes occur. A scene that depicts characters consuming a fictional substance and experiencing exaggerated effects might, in isolation, resemble a depiction of substance abuse. But in the context of the episode's narrative, the scene might function as a cautionary tale, a comedic exploration of the consequences of poor decision-making, or a narrative device that serves a thematic purpose unrelated to substance use. The fifth illegal episode's regulatory dispute also connects to the broader question of metaphor in children's content. Animated shows routinely use metaphor to address subjects that cannot be addressed literally within the constraints of children's programming. A show cannot depict a child experiencing depression, but it can depict a character who has lost their color and must undertake a journey to find it again. A show cannot depict a character struggling with addiction, but it can depict a character who becomes dependent on a fictional substance, whose effects parallel the effects of real addictive substances. The use of metaphor allows children's shows to engage with complex and important subjects without triggering the regulatory restrictions that literal depiction would provoke. But the metaphorical strategy depends on the standards department's willingness to accept the metaphor as metaphor rather than as a thinly disguised literal depiction. The willingness varies, and the variation introduces uncertainty into the creative process. The fifth illegal episode pushed the metaphorical boundary in a direction that the standards department was not willing to follow. The fictional substance's effects were too closely aligned with the effects of real intoxicating substances. The metaphor was too transparent. The standards department's response was to treat the metaphor as a literal depiction, which effectively collapsed the distance between fiction and reality that the metaphorical strategy depended on. The collapse was a signal to the creative team that the metaphorical strategy had limits, that the department would accept metaphors that were sufficiently distant from their real-world reference, but would reject metaphors that were too close. The signal was received. The fifth illegal episode occupies a unique position in the show's regulatory history because it is the episode that most clearly demonstrates the difference between what animated content depicts and what animated content means. The episode does not depict substance use. It depicts characters consuming a fictional substance in a fictional world where the laws of physics do not apply and the consequences of actions are temporary. The depiction has no real-world referent. No child could replicate the behavior depicted in the episode because the substance, the effects, and the physical context are all imaginary. But the standards department's assessment was not based on what the depiction was. It was based on what the depiction evoked, the association it triggered, the real-world behavior it brought to mind. The assessment was, in essence, an assessment of resemblance rather than identity, and the distinction between resemblance and identity is the distinction on which the fictional substance defense rises or falls. The fifth illegal episode's visual achievement, the innovative animation of the fictional substance's effects, deserves recognition independent of the regulatory dispute. The sequence represented some of the most technically ambitious animation the show had produced to that point. The warping of the photographic backgrounds, the distortion of the characters' physical forms, the use of color and movement to create a subjective visual experience of altered consciousness. All of these techniques were developed specifically for this episode and pushed the show's production pipeline in directions it had not previously been asked to go. The regulatory removal of the sequence in some territories meant that audiences in those territories were denied not only the comedic content of the scene, but the visual artistry that the scene contained. The artistry was invisible to the regulatory process because the process evaluated content, not craft. The same sequence evaluated for its animation quality rather than its content would have been one of the most praised pieces of work in the show's entire run. The fifth illegal episode's regulatory history also illustrates the temporal dimension of content regulation. Standards change over time. Content that was flagged for removal in 2013 might be approved without comment in 2023 because the cultural attitudes that informed the 2013 assessment have shifted, because the specific individuals conducting the review have changed, or because the accumulation of precedent has expanded the boundaries of acceptable content. The fifth illegal episode was produced at a specific moment in the history of children's content regulation, and the regulatory response it received was specific to that moment. The episode's regulatory status is not permanent. It is a historical artifact, a record of what was and was not permissible at a particular time and place, and subsequent episodes calibrated their metaphors accordingly. The production team's response to the fifth illegal episode was to develop more sophisticated metaphorical strategies that maintained greater distance between the fictional depiction and its real-world referent. The strategies were effective. Subsequent episodes addressed similar themes through metaphors that the standards department approved. But the increased distance between the metaphor and its referent also reduced the metaphor's emotional and communicative power. A metaphor that is too close to reality is flagged. A metaphor that is too far from reality loses its meaning. The creative challenge was to find the precise distance that was close enough to communicate and far enough to survive. And the precision required was itself a form of creative skill that the team developed through experience and through the specific kind of frustration that the fifth illegal episode provided. The regulatory process strips the context and evaluates the surface. and the surface, divorced from its context, can appear more problematic than the content actually is. The defense worked in some territories and failed in others, producing the familiar patchwork of edited and unedited versions. The substance use controversy highlighted a specific challenge that animated shows face in navigating content regulations. Live-action shows can depict intoxication unambiguously because they depict real human beings consuming real or simulated substances. The depiction is clearly what it is, and the regulatory response is calibrated to the clarity of the depiction. Animated shows operate in a space of visual metaphor where the boundary between literal and figurative is inherently unstable. A character who consumes a fictional substance and exhibits exaggerated behavior could be depicting intoxication, or could be depicting the show's normal exaggerated physicality, or could be depicting something that has no real-world equivalent. The interpretation depends on the viewer's assumptions, and the standards department's job is to assess the most problematic interpretation and make decisions based on that assessment. The result is that animated shows are sometimes regulated based on what they might mean rather than what they actually depict. The fifth illegal episode's intoxication metaphor raises a broader question about the purpose of metaphor in children's storytelling. Metaphor exists, in part, to allow stories to address subjects that cannot be addressed directly. When a children's show depicts a character consuming a fictional substance and experiencing altered perception, the show is using metaphor to create a space where the audience can think about intoxication without the narrative explicitly being about intoxication. The thinking is the point. The metaphor invites the audience to make a connection, and the act of making the connection is a form of cognitive engagement that is more valuable, pedagogically, than being told the connection directly. The standards department, by flagging the metaphor as inappropriate, was essentially arguing that children should not be invited to make this particular connection. The production team, by constructing the metaphor carefully enough to maintain plausible deniability, was arguing that the invitation was precisely what made the scene valuable. The visual language of the intoxication sequence was one of the most ambitious things the show had attempted up to that point. The animation team used distortion effects, color shifts, and perspective changes to convey the character's altered perception without ever depicting a real substance or a real physiological response. The visual approach drew from a long tradition of animated depictions of altered states, stretching back to the experimental animation of the mid-20th century. And it pushed the show's visual vocabulary in directions that the team had not previously explored. The sequence was, by purely aesthetic standards, some of the best animation the show ever produced. The fact that it was also the animation most likely to be flagged by the standards department is not a coincidence. Creative ambition and regulatory risk are correlated in children's television, because the things that push the medium forward artistically are often the same things that push against the boundaries of what the regulatory framework considers acceptable. The compromise that the standards department eventually approved for the fifth illegal episode was instructive. The fictional substance remained. The character's consumption of the substance remained. The altered perception remained. What changed was the framing. The original version had presented the altered perception as neutral, an experience that was neither positive nor negative, but simply different. The approved version added contextual cues that framed the experience as disorienting and unpleasant, ensuring that the metaphor, if recognized as a metaphor for intoxication, would communicate a cautionary rather than a celebratory message. The creative team accepted this compromise because it preserved the core of the sequence while conceding the framing, but they also recognized that the compromise had changed the meaning. A neutral depiction of altered perception is a fundamentally different narrative object from a cautionary depiction, and the difference matters because it determines what lesson the metaphor teaches. The fifth illegal episode's compromise also had implications for the show's relationship with its own tone. Gumball had built its identity on tonal unpredictability, the ability to shift from slapstick to sincerity to surrealism within a single scene. The intoxication sequence in its original form was an example of this tonal range, a sequence that moved through comedy, disorientation, and quiet reflection without settling into any single register. The approved version flattened this tonal range by imposing a consistent cautionary frame. The sequence became more coherent in the sense that it communicated a single clear message, but it also became less interesting, in the sense that the tonal complexity that had made it distinctive was reduced to tonal uniformity. The show lost a small piece of its identity in the edit, and that loss, multiplied across dozens of similar compromises over the show's run, contributed to a gradual narrowing of the show's tonal palette that dedicated viewers could detect even if they could not articulate its cause. The sixth illegal episode involved the show's treatment of death. An episode produced during the fifth season contained a sequence that addressed mortality with a directness that the standards department found uncomfortable for children's programming. The sequence did not depict a character dying, It depicted characters discussing death in terms that were emotionally honest and philosophically specific. The discussion included references to the permanence of death, the fear of non-existence, and the difficulty of accepting that consciousness ends. The content was not violent. It was not graphic, it was thoughtful, carefully written, and emotionally resonant. And it was flagged because the Standards Department's guidelines for children's programming include restrictions on the depiction of death that extend beyond physical violence to include discussions of death that might cause anxiety in young viewers. The removal of the death discussion was one of the most contentious editorial decisions in the show's history. The production team argued that children think about death, that they have questions about death, and that providing thoughtful, honest engagement with those questions is one of the most valuable things a children's show can do. The Standards Department argued that the discussion exceeded the show's target audience's developmental readiness for the specific philosophical concepts being addressed. The argument was conducted through the institutional channels that govern such disputes: memos, meetings, phone calls, revised cuts submitted for re-review. The resolution was a compromise that satisfied neither party. The discussion was shortened and softened, with the most philosophically specific references removed and the remaining dialogue adjusted to emphasize comfort rather than confrontation. The death discussion removal is particularly significant because it represents the regulatory framework's most direct conflict with the show's deepest creative ambitions. The show's willingness to engage with difficult subjects, including death, was one of its most valuable qualities. The engagement was not reckless, it was careful, thoughtful, and informed by an understanding of the audience's emotional needs that the Standards Department's guidelines, which were written for a generic children's show rather than for this specific children's show, could not fully account for. The show's audience included children who were thinking about death, children who had experienced the death of a pet, a grandparent, a family member, children who lay awake at night wondering what happens when consciousness ends. The show's willingness to address these thoughts directly, without condescension and without false reassurance, was a gift to those children. The removal of the discussion replaced a gift with a gap. The specific philosophical concepts that were removed from the 6th illegal episode have been partially reconstructed from accounts provided by members of the writing staff. The original scene included a character expressing the fear that death is not a transition to another state, but a termination of all states. The fear is existential in the philosophical sense. It concerns the nature of existence itself rather than the circumstances of a particular death. The Standards Department's objection was not to the fear itself, which is a normal and developmentally appropriate concern for children in the show's target age range, but to the specificity with which the fear was articulated. The department's guidelines permitted characters to express sadness about death in general terms. They did not permit characters to articulate specific philosophical positions about the nature of death that might cause the audience to think about death in ways they had not previously considered. The distinction between general sadness and specific philosophy reveals the Standards Department's underlying assumption about the purpose of children's content. The assumption is that children's content should comfort rather than challenge, that it should help children process emotions they are already experiencing, rather than introduce them to emotions they might not yet have encountered. The assumption is protective, and it is also limiting. A children's show that can only address emotions the audience already has is a show that cannot expand the audience's emotional range. The 6th illegal episode attempted to expand the audience's emotional range by introducing philosophical concepts about death that some viewers might not have encountered before. The expansion was the show's gift. The regulatory removal was the institution's refusal of the gift. The creative team's ongoing negotiations with the Standards Department about death-related content produced a set of unwritten rules that govern the show's approach to mortality for the remainder of its run. Characters could discuss death in general terms, but could not articulate specific fears about what death entails. Characters could express sadness about loss, but could not explore the philosophical implications of loss. Characters could acknowledge that death exists, but could not examine what death means. The unwritten rules were more restrictive than the official guidelines because they were shaped not by the guidelines themselves, but by the specific interpretive tendencies of the individuals who enforced them. The team learned to work within these unwritten rules. The death discussion episode connects to a tradition in children's media that stretches back decades. Shows like Sesame Street addressed death directly in the 1980s, with the episode dealing with the death of Mr. Hooper's actor, an episode that is widely regarded as one of the most important and most valuable pieces of children's television ever produced. The show addressed death honestly, without euphemism, and with attention to the specific emotional needs of its young audience. The episode is cited as a model of how children's media can and should engage with difficult subjects, but the regulatory landscape has changed since the 1980s. The standards that govern children's programming have become more restrictive, not less, in their treatment of death and mortality. The space that Sesame Street occupied in the 1980s, the space of honest engagement with mortality in children's content, has shrunk. The sixth illegal episode of Gumball was an attempt to reclaim some of that space, and the regulatory response demonstrated how little of the space remains. The philosophical specificity that was removed from the sixth illegal episode is worth considering in the context of what children's media typically offers as an alternative. The standard treatment of death in children's programming involves euphemism, vagueness, and reassurance. Characters who die go to a better place. Characters who are sad about death are comforted by the knowledge that the dead person is still with them in some undefined spiritual sense. The standard treatment provides comfort without honesty, reassurance without engagement, emotional resolution without intellectual substance. The sixth illegal episode attempted something different. It attempted to provide comfort through honesty, to reassure the audience not by pretending that death is something other than what it is, but by demonstrating that the fear of death is universal, that the philosophical questions death raises are worth asking, and that the inability to answer those questions is not a failure but a condition of being alive. The attempt was creative, ambitious, and philosophically sophisticated, and it was rejected. The rejection of the death discussion raises a question that extends beyond this specific episode to the entire regulatory framework. The question is, what are children's media for? If children's media are for comfort, then the Standards Department's removal of the death discussion was appropriate. The discussion was uncomfortable. It introduced philosophical uncertainty into a genre that typically offers philosophical certainty. It challenged the audience rather than reassuring them. But if children's media are for growth, for the expansion of emotional and intellectual capacity, for the introduction of ideas and experiences that broaden the audience's understanding of the world, then the removal was harmful. It removed exactly the kind of content that makes children's media valuable. The content that trusts the audience with complexity, rather than protecting them from it. Finding ways to gesture toward philosophical depth without triggering the regulatory response that explicit philosophical engagement would provoke. The original version of the scene, the version that the writers had carefully crafted to balance honesty with sensitivity, exists only in the production files. The sixth illegal episode is worth lingering on because of what it reveals about the assumptions that govern children's television. The assumption that children should be protected from discussions of death is one of the most deeply held assumptions in the industry. And it is also one of the most questionable. Children encounter death. They encounter it in their families, in their communities, in the natural world around them. They encounter it in their own imaginations, where it takes forms that are often more frightening than anything a television show could depict. The question is not whether children will encounter the concept of death, but whether the media they consume will help them make sense of the encounter when it comes. Research in developmental psychology has consistently shown that age-appropriate discussions of death help children develop healthy coping mechanisms. Children who have been given language and frameworks for understanding death process grief more effectively than children who have been shielded from the concept entirely. The shielding approach, which is the approach that children's television generally adopts, can produce a paradoxical effect. By refusing to acknowledge death, the media environment creates a gap between the child's lived experience, where death is present, and the media landscape where death is absent. The gap itself becomes a source of anxiety. The child learns that death is something so terrible that even cartoon characters are not allowed to discuss it, which makes the concept more frightening rather than less. The show's creative team had been influenced by children's literature, which has a longer and more established tradition of addressing difficult subjects, including death. Books like Charlotte's Web and Bridge to Terabithia had demonstrated decades earlier that children could engage with the concept of death in fiction and emerge from the experience not traumatized but enriched. The challenge for the show was translating that literary tradition into a medium governed by different rules. A book is consumed privately, a television show is broadcast publicly, a book is chosen by a parent or a child, a television show is encountered by anyone who happens to be watching at the time. The regulatory framework for television accounts for the difference in consumption context, and it accounts for it by restricting what can be said about death to a degree that literary regulation has never approached. The production team also understood something about the show's audience that the Standards Department may not have fully appreciated. The audience for a show like Gumball was not composed entirely of young children. A significant portion of the audience was composed of older children, teenagers and young adults, who watched the show for its sophisticated humor and its willingness to engage with complex themes. For this portion of the audience, a discussion of death was not merely age-appropriate, but expected. They watched the show precisely because it was willing to go to places that other children's shows avoided. The sixth illegal episode was, in part, an attempt to serve this audience segment, and the Standards Department's intervention represented a decision to prioritize the youngest and most vulnerable potential viewer over the actual audience that the show had cultivated. The scene's removal also created a narrative problem that the production team had to solve in post-production. The original episode had been structured so that the discussion of death served as a turning point for the character's emotional arc. Without the scene, the arc had no turning point. The character's emotional journey went from setup to resolution, without the middle passage that made the resolution meaningful. The team inserted a replacement scene that gestured toward the same emotional territory, without mentioning death explicitly, using metaphor and visual suggestion to imply what they were no longer permitted to state. The replacement scene was well crafted, but it lacked the directness that had made the original scene powerful. Metaphor is useful, but there are moments when only plain language will do, and the discussion of death is one of those moments. The sixth illegal episode connects to a pattern that runs through the entire history of children's television. The subjects that children most need to see addressed in their media are often the subjects that the regulatory framework most aggressively restricts: death, grief, loss, family conflict, mental health, physical vulnerability. These are the experiences that define childhood for many children, and they are the experiences that children's television is least equipped to address directly. The restriction creates a paradox. The medium that has the widest reach, that speaks to the most children, that could do the most good by addressing difficult subjects with sensitivity and care, is the medium that is most constrained in its ability to address those subjects at all. Other media forms have found ways to navigate this paradox. Children's literature, as noted earlier, has a long tradition of addressing death and grief directly. Children's theater has explored these themes with remarkable depth and sensitivity. Even children's music has found ways to acknowledge difficult experiences within its formal constraints. Children's television lags behind all of these media forms in its willingness to engage with difficulty. And the lag is not because television creators are less courageous or less skilled than their counterparts in other media. The lag is structural. Television is regulated differently because it is consumed differently. A book is chosen. A television broadcast is encountered. The regulatory framework is designed to protect the child who encounters content without choosing it, and the protection takes the form of restriction. The sixth illegal episode's most lasting impact may be on the creative team itself. Several members of the production team have spoken publicly about the episode's removal as a turning point in their understanding of what the show could and could not accomplish. Before the sixth episode, some members of the team had believed that the show's willingness to push boundaries was unlimited, that if they could construct a scene with sufficient skill and sensitivity, the Standards Department would recognize its value and approve it. The sixth episode disabused them of this belief. The scene was skillfully constructed, it was sensitively handled, it addressed its subject with genuine care, and it was removed anyway because the subject itself was beyond the regulatory boundary, regardless of how carefully it was approached. The lesson was not that they should try harder. The lesson was that some boundaries are not negotiable, and the creative challenge is not to breach those boundaries, but to find ways to work around them that preserve as much of the original intent as possible. The seventh illegal episode involved the show's engagement with political content. An episode produced during the fourth season contained references to real-world political figures and events that were embedded in the show's characteristic style of visual and verbal satire. The references were not partisan. They did not advocate for a specific political position. They satirized political culture in general, the performative nature of political speech, the gap between political promises and political outcomes, the absurdity of political messaging, aimed at audiences that are too young to vote. But the Standards Department's guidelines for children's programming include restrictions on political content that are broader than the restrictions applied to adult programming, and the episode's political references were flagged for review. The political content restriction reveals one of the most philosophically interesting aspects of children's content regulation. The restriction assumes that children are unable to process political content critically, that they will absorb political messaging uncritically, and be influenced by it in ways that adult viewers would not be. The assumption is paternalistic and, according to a significant body of developmental research, inaccurate. Children are capable of sophisticated critical thinking about political messages, particularly when those messages are presented in contexts that encourage critical engagement. The show's satirical approach to political content was designed to encourage exactly this kind of critical engagement. The satire did not tell children what to think about politics. It encouraged them to think about politics, to notice the absurdities and the contradictions that adults have learned to overlook. The political content removal also reveals the regulatory framework's relationship with the concept of neutrality in children's programming. The framework assumes that children's content should be politically neutral, that it should not advocate for specific political positions or engage with politically contentious subjects. The assumption of neutrality is itself political, a point that media scholars have made repeatedly, and that the regulatory framework has not fully acknowledged. A show that does not discuss politics is not neutral. It is teaching its audience that politics is not worth discussing, that political engagement is an adult activity that children should not participate in, that the political structures that shape children's lives are not subjects that children's media should address. The absence of political content is itself a political statement, and the statement is conservative in the most literal sense. It conserves the existing political order by declining to examine it. The specific political references that were removed from the 7th illegal episode have not been fully documented, but accounts from production staff suggest that the references targeted the machinery of politics rather than specific political positions. The show satirized press conferences, campaign advertising, political debates, and the gap between political rhetoric and political action. The satire was nonpartisan. It was equally critical of all political actors regardless of their position on the political spectrum. But the Standards Department's guidelines did not distinguish between partisan and nonpartisan political content. All political content was subject to the same restrictions, and the restrictions were applied without regard to the satirical intent or the educational value of the content. The 7th illegal episode's removal was particularly frustrating for the creative team, because the episode had been designed as one of the show's most ambitious educational experiments. The team had consulted research on civic education for children and had designed the episode to introduce concepts about democratic participation, institutional accountability, and the relationship between citizens and their representatives. The research that informed the episode's design suggested that early exposure to political concepts, presented in age-appropriate formats, contributed positively to children's long-term civic engagement. The political content removal also illustrates the regulatory framework's relationship with the concept of childhood innocence. The framework assumes that childhood is a state of innocence that should be preserved, and that exposure to political content threatens that innocence by introducing children to the messy, compromised, frequently disappointing reality of political life. The assumption is romantic. It imagines childhood as a protected space where the difficulties of adult life have not yet intruded. But the assumption does not match the reality of most children's lives. Children live in politically structured worlds. They attend schools governed by educational policies. They live in communities shaped by zoning laws, tax policies, and public spending decisions. They are affected by immigration policy, healthcare policy, environmental policy, and economic policy in ways that are direct and concrete. The assumption that children should be protected from political knowledge is the assumption that children should be ignorant of the forces that shape their daily lives. The 7th illegal episode's satire was specifically designed to make political concepts accessible to its young audience. The show used its established comedic techniques, exaggeration, personification, visual metaphor, to present political processes in ways that were funny and comprehensible. A press conference became a stand-up comedy routine. A political campaign became an absurdist competition. The techniques did not trivialize politics. They translated politics into a language that the show's audience could understand, a language of humor and exaggeration that the audience had been trained to interpret through their experience with the show's broader comedic vocabulary. The removal of the 7th illegal episode's political content was felt particularly acutely by the creative team, because the episode had represented an unusually collaborative effort within the writing staff. Multiple writers had contributed ideas and perspectives to the episode's development, and the collaborative process had produced an episode that the team considered one of their strongest. The removal did not just eliminate content, it eliminated the product of a collaborative creative process that had functioned at a high level, and the elimination was experienced as a collective loss rather than as an individual setback. The 7th illegal episode's regulatory history became a cautionary tale within the production that influenced subsequent creative decisions. The team became more cautious about political content, not because they believed the Standards Department was correct, but because they had learned that political content generated regulatory friction that consumed creative resources without producing a corresponding creative benefit. The political satire that the team continued to include in subsequent episodes was subtler, more deeply embedded in the show's established comedic structures, and harder for the Standards Department to identify and flag. The subtlety was a creative achievement born of regulatory constraint, and the achievement came at the cost of the directness that the 7th illegal episode had attempted. The Standards Department's removal of the political content contradicted the research that the creative team had used to justify its inclusion. The Standards Department's removal of this content removed not a dangerous influence, but an educational opportunity. What makes the 7th illegal episode particularly interesting in retrospect is the way the political content was constructed. The show did not simply insert political commentary into a children's cartoon. It built a political argument using the tools of animated comedy, which meant that the argument was both more accessible and more subversive than anything a live-action show could have achieved. The characters existed in a world that functioned as a distorted mirror of reality. The political structures in Elmore were recognizable enough to be understood, but exaggerated enough to be funny, and the exaggeration served a purpose that went beyond comedy. When you watch a cartoon character navigate a bureaucratic system that is transparently absurd, you are watching a critique of bureaucracy that does not need to announce itself as critique. The humor is the argument. The absurdity is the thesis. The Standards Department understood this, which is precisely why they intervened. The creative team had studied how other animated shows had handled political content, and they had drawn a specific set of conclusions from that study. Shows that presented political content earnestly as direct commentary on real political issues were flagged immediately and consistently. Shows that embedded political content inside absurdist comedy were flagged less frequently and less consistently. The lesson was clear. The regulatory framework was not opposed to political content as such. It was opposed to political content that was recognizable as political content. The more transparent the political argument, the more likely it was to be flagged. The more deeply the argument was buried inside comedic structure, the more likely it was to survive the review process. The 7th illegal episode had attempted a middle path, political content that was embedded in comedy but not so deeply embedded that the argument disappeared entirely, and the Standards Department had judged that the argument was too visible. The specific political content that was removed dealt with institutional authority and individual autonomy, themes that are not inherently controversial, but that become controversial when they are presented to children in a way that invites the children to question the institutions they encounter in their daily lives. Schools, families, governments, media companies. The show was asking its audience to notice that the institutions around them operated according to rules that were not always rational and not always fair, and to consider what they might do about that. This is civics education at its most basic level, the kind of thinking that democratic societies claim to want their children to develop. And the Standards Department's removal of the content suggests that the desire for children to think critically about institutions has limits that are rarely acknowledged publicly. The production team responded to the 7th illegal episode by developing what they internally referred to as a graduated approach to political content. Rather than attempting to include political commentary in concentrated doses, which attracted regulatory attention, they distributed political observations across multiple episodes, embedding individual observations so deeply into the show's existing comedic structures that no single observation rose to the level of a flaggable political statement. The approach was successful in the sense that subsequent political content largely survived the Standards Review. It was unsuccessful in the sense that it prevented the show from ever achieving the sustained, focused political commentary that the 7th illegal episode had attempted. The graduated approach produced many small observations but precluded the extended political argument, which requires sustained engagement with a single political idea across multiple scenes and multiple narrative beats. You can see this pattern clearly if you watch the episodes that follow the 7th. The political observations are there, scattered through background gags and throwaway lines and character reactions that last half a second, but they never build on each other. They never accumulate into an argument. Each one is a complete unit, designed to be noticed and appreciated individually, but not designed to connect with the other political observations in other episodes. The show's political commentary became, by regulatory necessity, a collection of fragments rather than a coherent whole. The 7th illegal episode also raises a question about the relationship between animation and political speech that is rarely examined in regulatory discussions. Animation occupies a unique position in the media landscape because it is simultaneously understood as a medium for children and recognized as a medium capable of sophisticated adult commentary. This dual identity creates a regulatory problem. When an animated show includes political content, the regulatory framework must decide which version of the medium it is regulating. Is it regulating a children's show that has included inappropriate adult content? Or is it regulating a sophisticated animated work that happens to be accessible to children? The answer depends on the show's scheduling, its marketing, its channel placement, and a dozen other contextual factors that have nothing to do with the content itself. The 7th illegal episode was the same content regardless of which framing the regulatory body applied. What changed was the regulatory response, and the regulatory response was determined not by what the content said, but by the institutional context in which it appeared. The loss of focused political commentary is particularly significant in the context of Gumball's audience demographics. The show's audience included a substantial population of viewers between the ages of 10 and 14, an age range that educational research identifies as a critical period for the development of political awareness and civic identity. These viewers were old enough to recognize political satire and young enough to be shaped by their early encounters with it. A show that offered sustained, focused political commentary to this audience would have been performing a civic function that few other media products in their consumption environment were equipped to perform. The 7th illegal episode represented the show's most ambitious attempt to serve this function, and its removal reduced the show's civic contribution to the scattered, fragmented observations that survived the graduated approach. The 8th illegal episode involved the show's depiction of bodily functions in a manner that the standards department deemed excessive. The episode contained an extended sequence of bathroom humor that pushed beyond the show's established boundaries for this type of content. The sequence was designed to escalate, each joke building on the previous one, the humor becoming increasingly absurd and increasingly explicit, until the sequence reached a climax that the production team considered hilarious and the standards department considered inappropriate. The dispute over bathroom humor is one of the oldest and most predictable disputes in children's television. Every children's show that includes physical comedy will eventually push the boundaries of what the standards department considers acceptable bathroom humor, and the push will be met with resistance. And the resistance will produce a negotiated compromise that neither the creative team nor the standards department finds fully satisfactory. The bathroom humor episode reveals something about the difference between children's and adults' relationship with bodily humor. Children find bodily functions funny for reasons that developmental psychologists have explored in detail. The humor is connected to the developmental process of gaining control over bodily functions, a process that is recent enough in a child's memory to be both relatable and slightly transgressive. Adults who regulate children's content apply adult standards of taste to content designed for an audience whose standards of taste are fundamentally different. The mismatch between your sense of humor and the regulator's sense of decorum is the engine that drives the bathroom humor dispute in every children's show. And the specific sequence that was flagged in the 8th illegal episode pushed beyond the show's normal bathroom humor in two ways. First, the duration of the sequence exceeded what the standards department considered acceptable. A single bathroom joke delivered quickly and followed by a change of subject was generally permitted. An extended sequence that returned to the same bathroom-related subject matter multiple times, building in intensity and explicitness with each return, triggered the durational threshold that the department applied to potentially objectionable content. Second, the specificity of the humor exceeded the department's comfort level. Vague references to bodily functions were permitted. Specific, detailed, visually explicit depictions of bodily functions were not. The sequence in the 8th illegal episode crossed from vague to specific in ways that the standards department judged inappropriate. The production team's defense of the sequence was rooted in their understanding of their audience's humor preferences. Internal research conducted by the network had consistently shown that bathroom humor was among the most popular categories of humor with the show's target demographic. The research suggested that the audience's appetite for this kind of humor was substantially greater than the standards department's tolerance for it. The gap between what you wanted and what the institution would allow was a source of ongoing creative tension that the 8th illegal episode brought into sharp focus. The compromise that resolved the 8th illegal episode's regulatory dispute involved shortening the sequence and reducing its specificity. The truncated version retained the setup and the punchline of the original sequence, but removed the middle section, the escalating series of jokes that built toward the climax. The removal of the middle section changed the comedic structure of the sequence in ways that the production team found unsatisfying. Comedy that relies on escalation depends on the buildup. Remove the buildup and the punchline loses its force. The team described the truncated version as the skeleton of the original joke with the flesh removed. The structure was there, the rhythm was there, the punchline was there, but the journey to the punchline, the escalating series of callbacks and variations that made the original sequence a tour de force of comedic construction, was gone. The 8th illegal episode's bathroom humor dispute connects to a broader cultural anxiety about what constitutes appropriate humor for children. The anxiety has deep historical roots. Children's entertainment has always been subject to adult standards of taste that may not align with children's actual preferences. Adults who find bathroom humor crude or distasteful may project their distaste onto children, assuming that children share their aesthetic sensibilities. But children's humor is developmentally distinct from adult humor. Children in the show's target demographic find bodily functions funny for specific developmental reasons that have been well documented by researchers. The humor is not a deficiency in taste that needs to be corrected. It is a normal developmental phase that children move through naturally, and children's media that acknowledges and engages with this phase is meeting children where they are, rather than where adults wish they were. The debate over bathroom humor in children's media also raises questions about the purpose of humor in children's programming. Humor serves multiple functions in children's development. It provides emotional release, it facilitates social bonding, it develops cognitive flexibility through the recognition of incongruity and surprise. Bathroom humor specifically provides children with a safe space to explore subjects that are normally governed by social taboos, subjects related to bodily function, privacy, and the contrast between the public and pride itself. The exploration is psychologically healthy. It allows children to process anxieties related to bodily control and social propriety in a context that is playful rather than threatening. The Standards Department's restriction of bathroom humor does not eliminate children's need for this kind of exploration. It merely eliminates one safe context in which the exploration can occur. The truncated sequence was functional. It was not funny in the way the original sequence was funny, and the difference between functional and funny is the cost that the regulatory process imposed on this particular piece of creative work. The deeper irony of the bathroom humor dispute is that the Standards Department's objections ultimately proved the production team's point about the humor's effectiveness. The very fact that the regulatory body found the sequence excessive was evidence that the sequence worked. Comedy that provokes no reaction is comedy that has failed. The escalation structure that the Standards Department identified as problematic was precisely the structure that made the sequence funny, because escalation is how bathroom humor operates when it operates well. You build from the mild to the extreme, from the suggestion to the depiction, from the single instance to the repeated pattern. And the humor comes from your growing awareness that the show is going further than they expected it to go. Remove the escalation and you remove the mechanism. What remains is a single joke delivered at a moderate intensity, which is not a sequence at all, but a moment. And a moment of bathroom humor is rarely funny enough to justify its own existence. The production team understood this intuitively because they understood their audience. Children between the ages of 6 and 12 have a relationship with bathroom humor that adults generally underestimate. The humor is not merely about transgression, though transgression is part of it. The humor is about shared knowledge. When a show depicts a bodily function on screen, it acknowledges something that every child in the audience has experienced, and that the adult world generally pretends does not happen. The acknowledgement itself is the joke. The child watches the screen and thinks, "That happens to me." And the fact that it is happening on television, in a space controlled by adults, gives the experience a validation that the child rarely receives in other contexts. The Standards Department, by removing the sequence, was not merely removing a joke. It was removing an acknowledgement. It was telling you that the thing you already knew about and all experienced was too inappropriate to be shown, which is precisely the message that makes bathroom humor appealing in the first place. There is a pattern in children's television where the most heavily regulated content is also the most developmentally appropriate content. Bathroom humor is one of the clearest examples. Research in child development has consistently demonstrated that humor about bodily functions serves a developmental purpose. It helps children process their relationship with their own bodies. It normalizes experiences that children often find embarrassing or confusing. It provides a social framework for discussing topics that are otherwise difficult to discuss. The regulatory framework that governs children's television generally ignores this research. Not because the regulators are unaware of it, but because the regulatory framework is designed to respond to complaints from adults, and adults complain about bathroom humor with a frequency and intensity that has no correlation with the humor's actual impact on children. The Standards Department is caught between the research that says bathroom humor is developmentally appropriate and the complaint volume that says it is unacceptable. The complaint volume wins because complaints are visible and development is not. The 8th illegal episode also revealed something about the show's relationship with its own identity. Gumball had always used bathroom humor, but it had used it sparingly as one tool among many. The sequence that the Standards Department flagged was not a departure from the show's established approach. It was an intensification. The production team had decided for this particular episode to commit fully to a type of humor that they usually deployed in moderation. The decision was deliberate and the execution was precise. Every escalation was planned, every beat was timed. The sequence represented the production team's best work in a specific comedic register, and the regulatory response to that work was to reduce it to something ordinary. The team had reached for excellence in a genre that the institution considered inherently unexcellent, and the institution's response was to enforce mediocrity. That is a particular kind of creative loss, and it is worth naming as such. The dispute is never fully resolved because the mismatch is permanent. The 9th illegal episode involved the show's use of language that the standards department classified as inappropriate for the target audience. The episode contained a sequence in which characters used language that, while not technically profane, was close enough to profanity to trigger the standards review. The show had a long history of pushing against language restrictions through creative substitution, using invented words and near misses that communicated the intended meaning without using the specific words that were prohibited. The strategy was effective and well understood by the audience. Children and adults both recognized what the characters were almost saying, and the almostness was itself a source of humor. But the 9th illegal episode pushed the strategy past the point where the almostness provided sufficient cover. The substitutions were too close to the originals. The intent was too transparent. The standards department flagged the language and required revisions. The language dispute illuminates the arbitrary nature of linguistic taboos in broadcasting. The specific words that are prohibited in children's programming are prohibited not because of their literal meaning, but because of their social function. A word that describes a bodily function is permitted. A word that uses the same bodily function as an expletive is not. The distinction is entirely social. The sounds are meaningless in themselves. The meaning is assigned by convention, and the convention is enforced by regulation, and the regulation is applied to creative work that is designed to play with convention, to test boundaries, to explore the gap between what can be said and what cannot. The 9th illegal episode's language dispute also connects to the broader question of how children learn language, including the language that society considers taboo. Research in developmental linguistics has consistently shown that children acquire knowledge of taboo language through their social environment, not through media exposure. Children learn profanity from peers, from family members, from overheard conversations in public spaces. The contribution of children's media to children's knowledge of taboo language is negligible compared to the contribution of their direct social experience. The Standards Department's restriction of language in children's programming is not based on evidence that the restriction protects children from learning taboo language. It is based on the cultural expectation that children's programming should model ideal linguistic behavior, regardless of whether the modeling has any measurable effect on children's actual language use. The show's strategy of creative substitution, which the 9th illegal episode pushed too far, was itself a commentary on the arbitrary nature of linguistic taboos. By creating words that communicated the meaning of prohibited words without using the prohibited sounds, the show demonstrated that the prohibition was about sounds, not meanings. The audience understood the meaning regardless of the sounds used to convey it. The understanding was the point. The show was saying, through its creative substitutions, that the restriction of specific words is futile when the audience already possesses the concepts those words express. The censorship of language does not censor thought. It merely alters the packaging of thought, replacing one set of sounds with another while leaving the conceptual content intact. The specific revisions required by the Standards Department for the 9th illegal episode involved replacing several near-profanity substitutions with alternatives that were less phonetically similar to their prohibited originals. The revised words were further from the originals, which made them less funny, which was the cost. The humor of the original substitutions depended on their closeness to the prohibited words. The closer the substitution, the funnier the joke, because the humor came from the audience's recognition of what was almost being said. The 9th illegal episode's language dispute was also significant because it revealed the Standards Department's awareness of the show's audience's sophistication. The department's objection was not that the substitutions were profane. They were not. They were invented words that had no offensive meaning in any language. The objection was that the audience would recognize the substitutions for what they were, would understand that the characters were almost saying prohibited words, and would derive amusement from the almostness. The department was, in effect, objecting not to what the characters said, but to what the audience would think. The regulation of thought rather than speech, the restriction of implied meaning rather than explicit content, represents one of the most expansive interpretations of content regulation and one of the most difficult to apply consistently. The creative team argued that the audience's ability to recognize the substitutions was itself evidence of the substitution's appropriateness. If the audience already knows the prohibited words, which they clearly do if they can recognize the substitutions, then the substitutions are not introducing the audience to anything new. They are playing with knowledge the audience already possesses, transforming taboo language into a comedic game that acknowledges the existence of the taboo without violating it. The argument was logically sound, but the Standards Department's guidelines were not primarily concerned with logical soundness. They were concerned with the perception of propriety, and the near-profanity substitutions, however logical the defense of their use, created a perception of impropriety that the department was unwilling to accept. The evolution of the show's language play across its seasons reflects the ongoing negotiation between creative ambition and regulatory restriction. Early seasons used relatively distant substitutions that were clearly not related to any real profanity. Middle seasons pushed the substitutions closer to their prohibited originals, as the team developed a more precise understanding of the Standards Department's tolerance. The 9th illegal episode pushed too close, and the regulatory response recalibrated the team's understanding. Subsequent episodes returned to a distance that was further from the prohibited originals, but still close enough to generate the recognition-based humor that the strategy depended on. The oscillation between proximity and distance, between pushing and retreating, is the rhythm of creative work in a regulated environment. Move the substitution further from the original, and the recognition dims, and the humor dims with it. The show's language games, which were one of its most creative and most entertaining features, existed in permanent tension with the regulatory framework that defined the boundaries of acceptable speech. The 9th illegal episode also raises a question about the nature of language itself that the regulatory framework was not designed to address. When a character says a word that sounds like a profanity but is not technically a profanity, what has actually been communicated? The Standards Department operated under the assumption that meaning was carried by words, that the specific combination of letters and sounds that constituted a profane word was what made the word harmful. Remove the word, and you remove the harm. But the show's language games demonstrated that meaning is not carried by words alone. Meaning is carried by context, by delivery, by the relationship between what is said and what is understood. A substitute word delivered with the same emphasis, the same timing, the same emotional weight as the profane word it replaces, communicates the same meaning to any listener who recognizes the substitution. The harm, if harm is the correct frame, is not in the word. It is in the understanding. And the understanding is precisely what the substitution is designed to preserve. This is a philosophical problem that extends far beyond children's television, but children's television is one of the few domains where the problem is tested repeatedly and empirically. Every children's show that uses language-based humor eventually encounters the boundary between what can be said and what can be understood, and every show that encounters that boundary learns the same lesson. The boundary is arbitrary. It is drawn at the level of specific words rather than at the level of meaning, which means that it can be circumvented by anyone who understands how meaning actually works. The Standards Department knew that the show was circumventing the boundary. The production team knew that the Standards Department knew. The audience knew that both sides knew. The entire system operated on a shared understanding that the rules were being followed in letter while being violated in spirit, and everyone participated in maintaining the fiction that the letter was what mattered. There is something genuinely profound about this dynamic when you slow down and think about it. The regulatory framework created a situation in which children were exposed not just to creative language play, but to an implicit lesson about the nature of institutional authority. The institution makes rules. The rules are applied at the level of surface compliance. Everyone involved understands that surface compliance is not the same as substantive compliance. The institution maintains its authority by policing surfaces while ignoring depths. The regulated entity maintains its creative freedom by operating at the level of depth while presenting a compliant surface. This is not a dynamic unique to children's television. It is the dynamic that governs the relationship between institutional authority and individual creativity in virtually every domain of human activity. The 9th illegal episode, with its near profanity and its language substitutions and its carefully calibrated plausible deniability, was teaching its audience something true about how the world works, even if neither the production team nor the Standards Department would have described it in those terms. The specific substitutions that were flagged in the 9th illegal episode had crossed a line that the Standards Department defined by precedent rather than by principle. Previous episodes had used substitutions that maintained a comfortable distance between the substitute word and the profane word it replaced. The 9th illegal episode had narrowed that distance to the point where the substitution was barely a substitution at all. The substitute words were so phonetically similar to their profane counterparts that the gap between what was said and what was understood had shrunk to almost nothing. The standards department's position was that a substitution that does not actually substitute is not a substitution. It is a profanity delivered with plausible deniability, and plausible deniability is not sufficient to satisfy the regulatory standard. The dispute over phonetic distance also revealed something about the evolution of the show's audience. As the show matured, its audience matured with it. Viewers, who had been 8 years old when the show premiered, were 12 or 13 by the time the 9th illegal episode was produced. Their understanding of language had developed. Their ability to decode substitutions had sharpened. The phonetic distance that had been sufficient to maintain the fiction of clean language in earlier seasons was no longer sufficient for an audience that had grown more linguistically sophisticated. The production team had narrowed the phonetic gap not because they wanted to push the regulatory boundary, but because their audience had outgrown the wider gap. A substitution that a 7-year-old finds clever and a 13-year-old finds transparent is a substitution that serves neither audience. The team was trying to find a phonetic distance that would register as humor for both age groups, and that distance happened to be narrower than the standards department was willing to accept. The 9th illegal episode's regulatory history also illustrates the way that language standards in children's television are shaped by complaint patterns rather than by linguistic analysis. The standards department did not employ linguists. It did not commission phonetic analysis of the substitute words to determine their degree of similarity to profane language. It relied on the judgment of its staff, and crucially, on the complaints it received from viewers. A substitution that generated complaints was flagged. A substitution that did not generate complaints was approved. This meant that the effective standard was not linguistic proximity, but viewer sensitivity. And viewer sensitivity varied unpredictably based on factors that the production team could not anticipate or control. The same substitution might generate dozens of complaints when it aired on a weekday afternoon, and 0 complaints when it aired on a weekend morning, because the audience composition was different and the complaint-prone demographic was more or less represented. The production team's position was that the gap, however narrow, was still a gap, and that the existence of a gap, however small, meant that the standard had been met. The dispute was ultimately about where to draw a line on a continuous spectrum, which is a dispute that admits no principled resolution. The 10th illegal episode is the one that this video opened with, the episode that was edited 3 times before broadcast, the episode that contains a gap where content used to be, the episode that exists in a version that most viewers have seen and in versions that you probably have not. The 10th episode is not the most dramatic on this list, it is not the most controversial, it is the most representative. It represents in its triple editing and its visible gap the entire process that this video has been describing. The process by which creative work is produced and then evaluated, and then modified, and then broadcast in a form that is different from the form in which it was created. The gap in the 10th episode is a gap in every episode. Every episode of every children's show contains gaps, moments where content was removed or modified before the audience saw it. The gaps are usually invisible. The editorial process is usually seamless, but the gaps are there, and the content that once filled them is there too, existing in production files and in the memories of the people who made it. The 10 illegal episodes, taken together, reveal a system of content regulation that is simultaneously necessary and destructive. Necessary because children's content does require oversight, because the power differential between content producers and young audiences creates an ethical obligation to ensure that content is appropriate. Destructive because the regulatory process, which is designed to protect, also constrains, and the constraint falls disproportionately on the creative work that is most ambitious, most challenging, most willing to engage with the complexity of human experience in ways that might make audiences uncomfortable. The system of content regulation that these 10 episodes reveal is not a system that anyone designed. It is a system that evolved, accreting rules and procedures and institutional habits over decades in response to specific controversies, specific legal challenges, specific shifts in public sentiment. The system is not coherent. Its rules sometimes contradict each other. Its application is inconsistent across territories, across time periods, across the specific individuals who interpret and enforce the rules. The inconsistency is not a bug. It is a feature of a system that must be flexible enough to accommodate the enormous range of content produced for children's media, while providing enough regulatory structure to satisfy the institutional and public demand for oversight. The system works in the sense that it prevents the broadcast of content that would genuinely harm children. The system also fails in the sense that it prevents the broadcast of content that would genuinely benefit children. The successes and the failures are inseparable because they are produced by the same mechanism, the mechanism of caution, and caution cannot distinguish between content that is dangerous and content that is merely challenging. The creative team that navigated the system across 6 seasons of Gumball developed a set of skills that are rarely discussed in the context of animation production, but that are as essential to the show's success as the drawing and the writing and the voice acting. The skill of anticipating regulatory objections before they arise. The skill of embedding ambitious content within structures that are less likely to trigger review. This skill of producing alternative versions of scenes without losing the scene's essential qualities. The skill of accepting regulatory decisions without allowing the acceptance to diminish the creative team's ambition for subsequent episodes. These regulatory navigation skills are part of the craft of children's television production, and they are skills that the show's creative team honed to a high degree of proficiency over the course of the show's run. The question of whether the regulatory process made the show better or worse is a question that does not have a simple answer. The process made the show safer in the sense that the content that survived the review was less likely to generate complaints or regulatory action. But safety and quality are not the same thing, and the conflation of the two is one of the regulatory framework's most problematic assumptions. Some of the show's best creative work was produced in response to regulatory constraints, finding alternative ways to communicate ideas that the original approach could not survive the review process. The constraints forced invention, and the invention was sometimes more creative and more effective than the original approach would have been. But some of the show's best creative work was also lost to the regulatory process. Ideas that were produced, evaluated, and removed before the audience could see them. The lost work is the regulatory process's invisible cost, and the cost is impossible to quantify because the lost work cannot be evaluated by the audience that never saw it. The work that is most likely to be flagged is the work that is most likely to matter. The show survived every regulatory intervention on this list. It absorbed the removals and the modifications and the compromises and continued to produce work that pushed against the boundaries that had been imposed on it. The pushing was not defiant. It was persistent. The creative team did not declare war on the standards department. They negotiated. They learned. They developed strategies for embedding ambitious content within frameworks that would survive the review process. The strategies were clever and they were effective, and they produced a show that contained more depth, more complexity, more philosophical and emotional richness than its regulatory constraints should have permitted. Which brings us back to October 14th, 2014, and the episode with the gap. The gap is still there. If you watch the episode today, you can find it. A moment where the narrative jumps. A scene that ends slightly too early. A transition that does not quite connect. The triple editing of the 10th illegal episode, the fact that the standards department rejected not one but 2 versions of the same content before accepting a third, reveals something about the iterative nature of content regulation that is rarely discussed. The first rejection identified a problem. The first revision attempted to solve the problem while preserving as much of the original content as possible. The second rejection indicated that the revision had not solved the problem to the department's satisfaction, that the creative team's understanding of the boundary was still miscalibrated. The second revision abandoned the attempt to preserve the original content and simply removed it, accepting the narrative gap as preferable to a third rejection. The progression from preservation to modification to removal is a progression from creative optimism to creative pragmatism to creative surrender, and the progression occurred within the span of a few weeks. The production staff who worked on the 10th illegal episode later described the experience as one of the most frustrating in the show's history. The frustration was not primarily about the content itself, though the team believed the original content was strong. The frustration was about the process. The back and forth between the creative team and the standards department consumed time and creative energy that could have been directed toward new work. The regulatory process, which is designed to improve content, sometimes consumed the resources that could have been used to create content, and the consumption was felt most acutely in episodes like the 10th, where multiple rounds of revision were required. The gap that remains in the 10th illegal episode is, in a sense, a monument to the regulatory process itself. It marks the spot where creative work was produced and then unmade, where something existed and then was removed, where the show's creators and the show's regulators disagreed about what the audience could see, and the regulators won. The gap is not visible to most viewers, but its presence, like the presence of all the gaps in all the episodes on this list, shapes the show that the audience receives. The show you watch is not the show that was made. It is the show that survived the process of being made. The show that passed through the regulatory framework and emerged on the other side with most of itself intact, but not all of itself. The missing parts are the illegal parts, the parts that someone decided you should not see. The 10th illegal episode's 3 rounds of editing tell the story of the regulatory process in miniature. The first edit was straightforward. The standards department identified content that violated a clear and established standard. The production team removed the content and submitted a revised version. The second edit was more ambiguous. The replacement content did not violate any standard that the production team was aware of. The standards department flagged it not because it violated a rule, but because it occupied a space that the department considered risky. The concept of risk as opposed to violation is where regulatory discretion lives. A violation is objective. Risk is subjective. The standards department was exercising judgment, not applying policy, and the production team had no established framework for anticipating or challenging judgments that were not grounded in specific policy provisions. The third edit, which produced the version that eventually aired, was a negotiation the production team proposed. The standards department countered. The two sides converged on a version that neither side considered ideal, but both sides considered acceptable. The gap in the final episode is the scar left by the negotiation, the visible evidence that something was there and is no longer. What makes the 10th illegal episode uniquely instructive is the way it demonstrates that the regulatory process is not a filter applied to completed work. It is a creative force that shapes the work during production. By the time the third version of the episode was completed, the production team had spent more time on the regulatory negotiation than on any other aspect of the episode's production. The editing process had consumed more creative energy than the writing, the storyboarding, or the animation. The episode that aired was shaped as much by the standards department's concerns as by the creative team's vision, and the two influences are inseparable in the final product. You cannot point to a specific scene and say, this is the creative team's work and that is the standards department's influence. The two are woven together in every frame of the episode, because every creative decision was made in the context of the regulatory constraints, and the regulatory constraints were applied in the context of the creative decisions. The gap itself has become something of a legend among the show's most dedicated fans. There are online communities devoted to reconstructing what might have occupied the space where the gap now exists. The reconstruction efforts draw on production interviews, storyboard leaks, animation timing analysis, and frame-by-frame comparison of different territorial versions. None of these efforts have produced a definitive answer, because the missing content was removed thoroughly enough that its specific details cannot be recovered from the broadcast versions. But the efforts themselves are significant. They represent a kind of archaeological engagement with the text, a willingness to study not just what the show contains, but what it might have contained, and to find meaning in the absence as well as the presence. The 10 episodes on this list span the entire run of the show. They cover its earliest seasons and its latest. They address topics ranging from physical comedy to philosophical inquiry, from bathroom humor to political satire. Taken together, they constitute a map of the boundaries that the show pushed against throughout its existence. Each boundary was specific to its moment. The boundary around self-harm interpretation was a product of growing awareness of children's mental health. The boundary around religious imagery was a product of global distribution to culturally diverse territories. The boundary around same-gender relationships was a product of shifting social norms that moved faster in some territories than in others. But all of the boundaries share a common structure. They exist at the intersection of creative ambition and institutional caution, and they are negotiated, not imposed, through a process that transforms both the content and the people who make it. The gap is small. Most viewers will never notice it, but the gap represents something larger than itself. It represents the distance between what was made and what was shown, between what the creators wanted you to see and what the institution decided you were allowed to see. What you are left with after 2 hours of examining these 10 episodes is not outrage at the regulatory system and not sympathy for it, but something more complicated. The system works as designed. It prevents content from reaching audiences that the institution has decided should not see it. The prevention is effective. The content is removed. The episodes that air are the episodes that the standards department has approved. In that narrow sense, the system succeeds. But the system also imposes costs that are rarely accounted for. Creative costs, when ideas that could have expanded the medium are reduced to ideas that fit within the medium's established boundaries. Educational costs, when content that could have helped children understand difficult subjects is removed because the institution judges the risk of harm to be greater than the potential for benefit. Cultural costs, when the show that reaches you is a less ambitious, less courageous, less honest version of the show that was made. These costs are not visible in any individual episode. You watch the episode that aired and it seems complete. The narrative makes sense. The jokes land. The characters develop. The only way to know that something is missing is to know what was removed. And the only way to know what was removed is to study the regulatory history that most viewers never encounter. The 10 episodes on this list are the ones where the removal left traces, where the editing was visible enough or the controversy public enough that the missing content became part of the show's story. But for every episode on this list, there are episodes where the removal was seamless, where the editing was invisible, where you watched and enjoyed and never knew that you were watching a version of the show that was smaller than the version that was made for you. The show's relationship with its own regulatory history is one of the most interesting aspects of its legacy. Unlike shows that fought against regulation openly and publicly, Gumball engaged with its regulatory constraints quietly, pragmatically, and with a level of creative sophistication that deserves more recognition than it typically receives. The creative team did not view the standards department as the enemy. They viewed it as the weather, something to be accounted for, adapted to, occasionally sheltered from, but never defeated. The adaptations they developed, the material-specific violence calibrations, the graduated political content approach, the phonetic distance language games, were creative achievements in their own right, born from constraint and shaped by necessity. If there is a single lesson to carry away from these 10 episodes, it is that the line between what children are allowed to see and what children are capable of understanding is not the same line. The regulatory framework draws the first line. The children themselves, through their engagement with the content that reaches them, demonstrate where the second line falls. The gap between the two lines is where the most interesting questions about children's media live. It is the space where protection becomes restriction, where caution becomes condescension, where the desire to shield the audience from harm shades into the impulse to shield the audience from complexity. The 10 episodes on this list are all episodes that existed in that gap, and their regulatory histories are all stories about how institutions navigated the space between what they believed children needed to be protected from and what those children were already, in their own lives and in their own imaginations, perfectly capable of confronting. That distance exists in every episode of every children's show ever broadcast. The gap in this episode is simply the one that is visible. If you found something in these 2 hours that changed how you think about what you watch, subscribing means more than you might realize. Thank you for staying. Sleep well. I will see you in the next one.